Dallas Willard, in The Divine Conspiracy, says that the road to Emmaus is a story that is a perfect metaphor for the spiritual journey. And he recognizes that each of us find ourselves somewhere along the road to where we discover that Jesus has always been with us, unlocking the truth and saving us, sometimes even from ourselves. I've divided my thoughts for today into just 4 headings. The first is battered and bruised. The second, blind and bewildered. The third, bread broken for you. And the fourth, back to believing. And so if we look at the story of the road to Emmaus, we ask ourselves the simple questions that we would always ask if we were trying to analyze a story. Let's have a look first at the story.
Now that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleophas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the 3rd day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus." He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the 2 told what had happened on the way, and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread.
So battered and bruised. 2 of the disciples, people who had hung out with Jesus, most likely entered into Jerusalem triumphantly with Jesus, head off at the worst possible time, having experienced some of the worst possible things. we have two disciples on the road to Emmaus, which, by the way, I think is a mistitle. It's not the road to Emmaus. This is not a story about going somewhere. It is a story about going from somewhere. This probably would have been more accurately called the road from Jerusalem. And timing is important. We have two disciples who on the third day have heard rumors that there were women at the tomb who discovered that it was empty. They had heard reports that Jesus' body was missing. They knew the scriptures, and yet still, battered and bruised, head off about 7 miles away to a Roman garrison. This is a story about men and women walking a road of disappointment, of disillusionment, of disenchantment, discouraged, and with their back to the story that would change their lives. They are heading off defeated, perhaps even as deserters, just at the time when the entire story of Jesus and what he means to us was about to change with the resurrection. And yet we find them trudging along a road, downcast, sad, and defeated. And so sometimes we look at ourselves and we think we've experienced Jesus at our high. We know what Jesus can do. We've listened to his teachings. We've seen his miracles. We've heard him speak. We have hung out with his people. And yet something happens, some hardship, something almost too heavy to bear, that has us trudging away from him, when really we should be looking at how he brings life. And so we find ourselves on a rocky road, heading away from Jesus and away from the comfort that he offers, from the familiarity of what we have relied on. And we find ourselves blind and bewildered. Bewildered because we ask questions just like these two disciples might have been asking. I thought he'd be the one to get me out of this, to end all of this oppression, to end all of the horror that we have to face, to help me carry the load, to help us, to redeem us. I thought he was the one. And then blind, because at a point in our lives, in our own journeys, where we should see him clearly, we can't see him at all. We're not able to recognize Jesus on that rocky road, even if he walked right up to us and joined our conversation. And so I don't know about you, but I know many stories of people who have been walking along a rocky road, having experienced something very heavy to bear, and who should know that Jesus walks by their side, but just can't see him. And so they head off and don't really know what to do. The safety and security, the comfort of Christ's company that they have kept seems to have been lost, and they find themselves blind and bewildered. And there's so many things that blind us. Busyness blinds us. I suppose disenchantment blinds us. The fact that something didn't work out the way we thought it would blinds us. And so we walk around, we stumble along a road, wondering what happened to Jesus. Where is he now? Even though he's walking right beside us. If the story of the road to Emmaus, or the road from Jerusalem, ended when the two disciples headed off home in Emmaus, and the stranger who had joined them, who they had not recognized as Jesus, went further down the road, that would have been the end of the story. And the story would end in the same way it has for so many people who we know walked with Jesus, but didn't see him. The favorite part of the story, though, is when the two disciples say to the stranger, "Join us for supper." They return in some way to an ordinary life, a life less remarkable than the one they had walked with Jesus as his followers, a life where the preparation of food, the washing of dishes, perhaps even entertaining guests was the highlight of the day. And so they return to that ordinariness, still, I imagine, with the same feeling, the same deep sense of loss and loneliness. The fact that they had witnessed something, but had not seen it in their own life, but rather as an outsider, as something that would put them onto a road away from all of that. And I know people like that too. People who should know better, but who have just returned to a day, a diary day, something that is the same every day. No remarkable experience with Jesus because they've forgotten. They have failed to recognize him, and they have chosen to move on without him. And so my favorite part of the story is where Jesus does a simple thing. He sits at a family meal and he breaks bread, and immediately they recognize him. And that is a profoundly amazing thing. The idea that Jesus walks with us, we know that. But there comes a time in our life where, if we're lucky enough, if we are attentive enough, something happens that reminds us of everything. It's like when you walk into a place where they have just been baking bread, and that smell unlocks all your childhood memories of nibbling away at the crust on the way home, or hollowing out the bread, or something from a different time in your life. Jesus breaks this bread and everything comes rushing back to these two disciples. They recognize him immediately, just in the way he broke bread. He took bread, he gave thanks, and he shared it with them. And I really do think that the road to Emmaus story, the road from Jerusalem story, is filled with one primary thought, and that is bread broken for you. Once you realize that in your ordinary life, Jesus gave his whole life broken for you, there comes a moment where everything changes. And in fact, there's a beautiful painting that I'll put up now that you can have a look at. And then I'll read you a poem that was written in response to this beautiful painting. And it isn't a typical scene captured from the road to Emmaus. Just a very different interpretation. I hope you enjoy it, but it comes as a symbol of someone in a home recognizing Jesus' presence for the first time and expressing it. The Servant Girl at Emmaus by Denise Levertov. She listens, holding her breath. Surely that voice is his, the one who had looked at her once across the crowd, as no one ever had looked, had seen her, had spoken as if to her. Surely those hands were his, taking the platter of bread from hers just now, hands he'd laid on the dying and made them well. Surely that face, the man they'd crucified for sedition and blasphemy, the man whose body disappeared from its tomb, the man, it was rumored now, some woman had seen alive in the morning. Those who had brought this stranger home to their table don't recognize him yet. But she in the kitchen, absently touching the wine jug she's about to take in, a young servant, intently listening, swings round and sees the light around him and is sure. My prayer for you and for me today, as we reflect again on a very familiar story, is that there will come a point where you see that Jesus is at your table, body broken for you, giving you the bread of life, and that you recognize that he walked with you along the rockiest of roads, that he shared scripture with you, and that he was the one that came triumphant into Jerusalem. My prayer for you and for me is that your response is just like that, and my response is just like that of these two men who were blinded and bewildered, battered and bruised. And yet when they saw Jesus, when they saw and recognized him at their table, in their very ordinary life, got up got back onto that same road and headed immediately back to Jerusalem to be with Jesus, to be with his people, to share the story that they now knew for sure, that Jesus was alive and walking with them, even on rocky roads.